Thanks very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you, Chris and the team, for inviting me to this NIHR MindTech meeting. So I'm going to sort of build a bit on what people have already said in this presentation. There's a slightly different focus, moving to slightly older ages, so 16 upwards, and a bit more of a focus on depression and anxiety than we've heard about. And I'm going to really be introducing the project that we're doing, which is called ECoWeB. I'm going to talk a little bit about co-design, but we're still in the process of doing that, so I can't really give you all the steps that the others have talked about. So we're a European-funded Horizon 2020 project that's about developing a mobile health app for young people, focusing on improving emotional intelligence type skills to both prevent mental disorders and promote well-being. And I need to acknowledge all of the partners in this project. It's a big project. We have 13 institutions across 8 European countries. I'm not going to list them all, but everyone in the team is busy contributing to taking the project forwards. So the background is, as we've heard already, there's a concern about the increase in prevalence of poor mental health, particularly in youth. And we've heard these statistics about growths in particularly anxiety and depression, emotional disorders in late adolescence, young adulthood, particularly in women. And therefore, we need to see how we can try and address that. We've heard about treatment. The other way we can try and address that is through prevention. There's been a huge call for taking that prevention work forwards. We do have effective preventions that are starting to be developed for emotional disorders in young people, for example, schools-based programs. But there's a recognition that we need to improve prevention. We need prevention that doesn't require large numbers of persons' hours from therapists or teachers so that we can make it more scalable. That is also, it needs to be scalable in the sense that it's acceptable, that people want to use it, and it doesn't have a stigmatizing problem that sometimes comes if we are starting from the point of a clinical perspective. And like all treatments, we can try and make them better and improve efficacy. So in ECoWeB, we're taking 3 approaches, which I'm going to give you a bit more detail on, to try and tackle those issues in innovative ways. So the first approach we're going to take is we're trying to improve functioning by increasing emotional competence skills in young people. And I'll say more about that. But if you think about emotional intelligence and the skills of emotional intelligence, that's one element. We're also going to build in personalised medicine, see if we can improve outcomes by targeting what we give to the individual. And we're going to use mobile app to deliver it as a way of trying to make it widely available. And the goal is to have a population-oriented prevention approach. So let me explain a little bit more about the different elements of the process. So our model is an idea that everyone has skills in emotional competence, and they vary, and they're on a continuum. So we can take this as a model to anyone, and we can apply it universally, which is really helpful for normalizing and making this population-based. So we're not saying this is about stigma or about, oh, you're someone who looks like you might be at risk for depression. We can say to young people, everyone has different types of emotional skills, and perhaps you might want to find out more about yours and how you can improve them. So if we think about what happens in emotions, typically what happens, some kind of event happens, and then there's an emotional experience with a range of facets involved. And there are 3 broad skills that we think are relevant to that. So there's emotional production skills, which is really how you interpret and appraise the event. Do you think you have control over it? How bad do you think it's going to be? And that can determine the nature of the emotion that you experience. And then there's emotional regulation skills. What do you do when you have that emotion? Does that make that emotion worse? Does it help to control it? Does it prolong it? And then linked to both of those skills is general emotional knowledge. So how good are you at recognizing your emotions, being aware of your emotions, perceiving other people's emotions? And that will obviously feed into how good you are at regulating and your appraisals. And there's a lot of evidence now that if any of those 3 elements are inaccurate or maladaptive, that puts people at risk for poor mental health, poor school performance, etc. So our goal is to try and tackle those different elements. And we're trying to do this in a personalised way. So there's an argument that if we can match intervention to the individual, they might be more acceptable, more engaging, and more helpful. Now, this is a hypothesis. It's not really been tested. It's particularly not being tested in mental health, despite calls to do that. So one of the things we want to do that's new is try that in ECoWeB. So what happens when participants come into the study, they're going to be assessed on these different emotional competence elements. And if they are receiving personalised treatment, we're going to try and give them the 2 elements where we think they would get the most benefit from getting further help in those areas. And then the way we're going to deliver this is through a mobile app. And there's obviously many potential benefits of apps. They're scalable, they're non-consumable, so lots of people can use them at relatively low cost. You can use them anywhere, anytime, so they're convenient. And particularly for the kind of things we're trying to do, people can use them in their daily lives. So they're useful for making changes in real world as it's happening, for changing habits. But it's also worth noting that despite the huge increase in mental health apps, a recent report suggested there are over 10,000 out there if you go to the different sites. Very few of them are either based in robust science or have been rigorously tested, either for safety or for any basic efficacy in a trial. There are a few that are emerging now with trials, but those tend to be relatively small. So one of our goals is to have one of the very first large-scale trials of a mental health app. So what are we going to do? We're going to build an app that uses this science to train emotional skills in 16 to 22-year-olds. We're going to monitor a large cohort of young people. We're aiming for 2,000 young people across the UK, Germany, Spain, and Belgium over a year. So people are going to be followed up, and we'll see what's happening to them over time. And within that, we're going to have 2 trials. A trial for the people who we think are at higher risk for getting disorder, so a prevention trial, and then a trial for everyone else, which will be for more promoting well-being. And what will happen in the trials is people either carry on just receiving assessments over time in the cohort and using the app for some self-monitoring, or they'll carry on in the cohort and get a personalised self-help app to give them emotional skills, or they'll have a generic CBT app. So this is a version of what's called a cohort multiple randomized control trial. So it's a very efficient way of running a study because we can have a cohort where we follow people over time and learn about their emotions and what's predicting their emotions and their skills. And then a subset of people from that who are eligible can either be for either prevention or promotion, can then be offered an intervention on top of carrying on in the cohort. And then if they're offered, for example, if they've got elevated risk on their emotional competence profiles, so we think, for example, if someone's a worrier, they're more likely to be at risk for depression, they then might be offered either carrying on in the cohort or the generic CBT or the personalised emotional competence. So that's the sort of broad design of what we're going to try and do to evaluate the app. And I think I've summarised the key things here. Our main outcomes will be depression outcome for prevention and well-being for the well-being study. And this has all been powered on very good statistical process. So what are we actually going to try and do in the interventions? Well, for the emotional production element, we're really going to focus on trying to improve appraisal. And the idea is to take evidence-based interventions that have been used in other contexts and try and put them into the app. So here's a few things that we know have got evidence in different contexts. So attributional retraining. So the idea here is that in academic contexts, particularly in school and university, there's very good evidence that if you can help people attribute doing well or doing badly to their own effort, to them making attempts to do things, they start to get a sense of control over what's happening, and that in itself leads to better outcomes. So that's what we're trying to do there. There's a growing literature on mindset, and I know this is something that's being rolled out into schools. Most folks who've got kids in schools at a certain age will now be aware this is appearing. So this is the idea that you can believe that your abilities are fixed and you can't change them. So you've got this level of intelligence and that's it. Or that things can change. The growth mindset, that your abilities can improve over time with practice and increment. And there's a lot of evidence now that teaching kids that about the growth mindset and that they can improve with practice and time is helpful. And there's been some single session interventions, not digital, but single session interventions that have shown that over 9 months that actually reduces depression and anxiety. So we're going to build that into the app. And then there's utility value interventions, which are about helping people think about what's useful and what's effortful and what they would get out of engaging in academic or work tasks. So you can see that some of these are quite focused on one of the key areas for young people in this age group, which is things like exam stress and tests and producing well on those things, but also can be applied more broadly. Similarly, we're going to build in things to work on social appraisal. So we're going to include a cognitive bias modification of interpretation task. So this is giving people ambiguous social situations and then training them to think about them in a positive way with a view that this might be helpful. This is an interesting area. There was a lot of positive evidence initially, and it's become more mixed, but it's mainly acute, and it's not been looked in a prevention context. In terms of emotion regulation, we're going to focus on one particular unhelpful maladaptive mechanism, which is rumination. So there's lots of evidence that multiple vulnerabilities and stressors and losses and triggers lead to increased worry and ruminating about difficulties, which in turn leads to increased anxiety and depression. In fact, it looks like it's a final route for a lot of risk factors. And we also know that if you shift people from being too global and too abstract when they're thinking about problems and get them more concrete, that helps them actually to shift into problem solving. So that's one of the things we want to try and do in the intervention. We also recognize that for some people, that worry and rumination becomes a habit. So we have an intervention that's based on helping people recognize when they're doing things as a habit, trying to break out of that habit by spotting the triggers and planning to do alternative things. And then we're looking at ways to shift their thinking in a way that's more helpful to a more adaptive problem-solving style, and also bringing in a more compassionate way of thinking to shift away from the critical thinking that we often see in worry and rumination. And we've got evidence on an internet platform that this is effective at reducing the rates of caseness of depression. So you can see here, this is people chosen who are high worriers and ruminators and followed over a year. If you just leave them to their own devices, effectively 30% of them report caseness for depression in a year. If you give them either a face-to-face version of the internet intervention, a face-to-face version of the intervention or internet version of the intervention, that drops that down to about 13% caseness. So it's over halving the incidence of depression over a year. So we want to see if we can translate that from an internet platform to an app. I'm going to skip this because this is an animation that I don't have time for. Yep. And then in terms of emotional knowledge, we've got some really interesting tasks. It's a shame I don't have time to show them. They're really fun, where we're interested in finding out how well people understand emotional situations, but also how good they are at perceiving other people's emotions. So we have these videos where you have people talking nonsense words from no language, but in different emotional states. And you have to work out the emotion and rate it on these wheels from their tone of voice, their non-verbal communication, gestures and face. And we can measure how good people are at doing this. So this will help us determine whether some young people are better at reading emotions than others. And then we can train them by doing the test and giving them direct feedback so that they get better at that. And we've got some evidence from the lab that we can improve emotion recognition this way, and it does start to transfer to tasks outside of emotion recognition. We also want to see if people are good at understanding emotional situations. So we have a model where emotion has actions and feelings and expression and internal physiology, like your heart rate or tension, and how you're thinking about things. So we have different vignettes where situations are described and all of these elements are described, and then you ask the person what emotion are they feeling, and then vignettes the other way around where someone is told this person's feeling this emotion, and then you have to work out which of those they might be feeling. And by giving feedback on that, we can also try and improve people's understanding of emotions. So the important point is that depending on the personalization, depending on which of those people are presenting as being better or worse on their profile, we will give those specific elements in the app. Co-design is really important. We've heard a lot about process for doing that. We're in that sort of first iterative cycle, if we think about what Kathy was talking about. So we've got a plan of the kind of things we want to do for our intervention, and we've got a plan for an app, but we need to put the two together and make sure they're engaging with young people. So we've started to sit down with paper mock-ups of how it might look, what it might involve, and get iterative feedback on that so we can make sure that the content is appropriate, the examples are appropriate, the functions that we're putting into the app are things that people want. So we haven't yet got to the next stage where we actually have a live thing that they can work on and we can get feedback on, but it's all on paper so far. But already we're getting really, really good information across our different sites. So we've already had over 20 hours of contact that's shaping the design and the functions of the app and the content. And what's really interesting is we've had some perhaps unsurprising messages that this sort of 16 to 22-year-old age group want flexibility, they want choice. So some of these original interventions were very structured and sequential. You did A, and then you did B, and then you did C. What we're hearing is, well, can we have A, B, and C so we can choose which one we want to go to first? So we're programming the app to do that. They want the elements to be brief, which is we had in mind already, that you can go in and you can use a tool or do something on the app for a couple of minutes and get benefit. And what's really interesting is that the overall message and design, they want it to be simple, they want it to be clean, but they don't want it to be like a game. They don't want to be charged. We talked about, do we set this up as people going on quests? So some people had some quite gamified versions of it that we were putting to these young people. They didn't really want it. What was the really interesting model that we got presented back to us was lots of young folks of this age are using language learning apps where they have sequences of things that they can do, and should we use, and so that's the kind of model they want. They want us to say, this is the science, here's how I could learn it, and then have simple ways of doing that. So that's been really useful feedback at this early stage. So the app is in development. We're working with Monsenso, who are here at the conference. Here's some examples from their previous monitoring app. So we've got an app that already works. And what's happening is we're building some of these features we've talked about into that app. So it's going to have tools that people can go to, have learning places where they can reflect on things or try exercises. They can plan their activities. They can track their mood. And they're going to have abilities to come back and see how they're progressing over time. So that's a kind of summary of where we're at the moment. As you can see, we're in the very early stages of developing the project. Lots of innovation to come, and I hope that we'll be able to come back in some years' time and tell you where we've got to. Thank you very much.